What if I told you that one of literature's greatest revenge stories actually happened? Not the version with buried treasure and elaborate disguises, but something even more disturbing. In 1807, a shoemaker named Francois Picaud was about to marry the woman he loved when his jealous friends falsely accused him of being a British spy. He spent 7 years in a dungeon, losing everything: his fiancée, his livelihood, his youth. But in that dungeon, a dying priest told him about a hidden fortune and taught him the skills he would need to destroy every person who had betrayed him. When Picaud finally emerged from prison, he was no longer a simple shoemaker. He had transformed himself into a wealthy, educated gentleman who spent the next decade systematically ruining the lives of the men who had stolen his future. He didn't just want them dead. He wanted them to suffer as he had suffered, to watch everything they loved crumble, to know that their destruction was revenge for what they had done to him. This is the true story that inspired Alexandre Dumas to write The Count of Monte Cristo. This is about a man who turned revenge into an art form, who spent years plotting the perfect destruction of his enemies, and who proved that patience and careful planning could be more devastating than any act of violence. This is the real Count, and his revenge was even darker than fiction. Francois Picaud was born in Nîmes, France, in the late 1770s, the son of working-class parents in a city that had seen enormous upheaval during the French Revolution. Nîmes was an ancient Roman city in southern France with a mixed population of Catholics and Protestants, and tensions between these groups had sparked violence throughout the revolutionary period. Into this turbulent environment, Francois grew up learning the shoemaker's trade, a respectable craft that provided a modest living. By 1807, Francois was in his late 20s and engaged to marry Marguerite Vigoureux, a young woman from a similar social background. The couple was planning their wedding, and Francois appeared to have a secure, if humble, future ahead of him. He had steady work, a fiancée who loved him, and friends he trusted. He had no reason to suspect that his entire life was about to be destroyed by petty jealousy. Francois had 3 friends who were part of his social circle in Nîmes: Mathieu Loupian, Solari, and Chaubart. These were men Francois had known for years, men he considered close friends, but at least one of them, sources suggest it was Loupian, was jealous of Francois. Perhaps he had wanted Marguerite for himself. Perhaps he simply resented Francois's happiness. Whatever the reason, Loupian decided to destroy Francois's life, and he convinced the others to help him. France in 1807 was in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars, and paranoia about spies was intense. Napoleon's empire was fighting Britain, and anyone accused of being a British spy faced immediate arrest and severe punishment. Loupian understood that a false accusation of espionage would be difficult to disprove and would result in Francois's immediate imprisonment. So Loupian and his co-conspirators went to the authorities and denounced Francois Picaud as a British spy, providing fabricated evidence to support their claim. The authorities arrested Francois without warning. He was given no opportunity to defend himself properly, no chance to confront his accusers or examine the evidence against him. In the paranoid atmosphere of Napoleonic France, the accusation itself was nearly enough to ensure conviction. Francois was tried quickly, found guilty of espionage, and sentenced to imprisonment in the fortress of Fenestrelle in the Alps, one of the harshest prisons in the French Empire. Francois's world collapsed in a matter of weeks. His engagement to Marguerite was broken, whether by her choice or her family's is unclear, but a woman could not wait indefinitely for a convicted spy imprisoned for an unknown term. His shoemaking business was destroyed, his property seized. His reputation was ruined. Everyone who had known Francois Picaud the shoemaker now knew him only as Francois Picaud the traitor and spy. The fortress of Fenestrelle was a massive military complex built into the side of a mountain in the Italian Alps, a series of fortifications connected by tunnels and staircases carved into rock. Prisoners held there faced brutal conditions: extreme cold in winter, minimal food, hard labor, and complete isolation from the outside world. Francois was thrown into a cell in this mountain fortress, and the authorities essentially forgot about him. He would spend the next 7 years in this hell, and for much of that time, he had no idea why he was there or who had betrayed him. In the fortress of Fenestrelle, Francois's life reduced to mere survival. The cold was intense, the food barely sufficient to sustain life, and prisoners died regularly from disease, malnutrition, or despair. Many prisoners went mad from isolation. Others simply gave up and let themselves die. But Francois survived, driven by a burning need to understand why this had happened to him. For years, Francois had no answers. He knew he was innocent of espionage, but he didn't know who had accused him or why. This uncertainty was its own torture. Had it been a genuine mistake? Had someone confused him with an actual spy? Or had he been deliberately betrayed? The questions consumed him, but he had no way to find answers. Then Francois's fortune changed, though in a strange and dark way. He was placed in a cell with or near another prisoner, a wealthy Italian priest, or abbé, who was also imprisoned in Fenestrelle. This priest, whose name is lost to history, became Francois's teacher, and ultimately the instrument of his revenge. Over several years, the priest and Francois formed a bond. The priest was educated, cultured, and possessed knowledge that a simple shoemaker would never have acquired. He taught Francois to read and write with sophistication. He educated him in literature, history, languages, and the manners of the upper classes. He taught Francois how wealthy people spoke, how they conducted themselves, what they knew and valued. In effect, he gave Francois the education of a gentleman. But the priest did more than educate Francois. He also told him about a treasure. According to the story that would later inspire Dumas, the priest had knowledge of a hidden fortune, wealth that had been concealed and could be recovered by someone who knew where to look. The exact nature and location of this treasure remains unclear in historical accounts, but the priest apparently gave Francois information that would later allow him to acquire substantial wealth. Most importantly, the priest helped Francois piece together what had happened to him. Through whatever sources of information were available in the prison, through letters, through gossip from guards, through the rumors that filtered even into isolated fortresses, Francois gradually learned the truth. He had been betrayed by his friends. Loupian, Solari, and Chaubart had deliberately destroyed his life out of jealousy and malice. There had been no mistake, no confusion. He was innocent, and they had known it. This revelation transformed Francois. The anger and confusion that had sustained him through years of imprisonment now crystallized into pure, focused rage. He had been robbed of 7 years of his life, of his marriage, of his livelihood, of his reputation, all because of 3 men's petty jealousy. And now he knew their names. Now he understood exactly what they had done and why. The priest, whether out of sympathy for Francois or for his own reasons, encouraged Francois's desire for revenge. Some accounts suggest the priest may have been a Jesuit, a member of a religious order known for their sophisticated understanding of psychology and politics. He allegedly taught Francois not just how to appear wealthy and educated, but how to manipulate people, how to identify weaknesses, how to orchestrate complex schemes. He taught Francois patience, the understanding that effective revenge requires careful planning and perfect timing. When the priest died, possibly in 1814, as the Napoleonic Empire was collapsing, he left Francois with all the knowledge and information he needed to transform himself and to destroy his enemies. Francois had entered prison as a naive shoemaker. He would leave as something else entirely, an educated, sophisticated man with a fortune to recover, a new identity to create, and 3 men to destroy. In 1814, with Napoleon's empire falling and political prisoners being released, Francois Picaud was freed from Fenestrelle after 7 years of imprisonment. He emerged a different person, hardened, educated, and absolutely committed to revenge. He had spent 7 years learning, planning, and preparing. Now it was time to execute his revenge. Francois's first task after release was to recover the fortune the priest had told him about. Historical accounts are vague about exactly what this treasure was, where it was located, or how Francois accessed it. Some versions suggest it was money hidden by the priest's family. Others suggest it was information about valuables that could be recovered. What's clear is that within a relatively short time after his release, Francois had acquired significant wealth, enough to transform his appearance and social status completely. With money in hand, Francois began his transformation. He moved to a different part of France, where no one knew him as Francois Picaud the shoemaker. He purchased expensive clothes, hired servants, and presented himself as a wealthy gentleman. He studied the manners and speech of the upper classes, using the education the priest had given him to pass as someone born to wealth. He was no longer Francois Picaud. He had become someone else, a man of mystery and means. Next, Francois began investigating his betrayers. What had become of Loupian, Solari, and Chaubart in the 7 years since they had destroyed his life? Francois learned that his enemies had prospered from their betrayal. Loupian, the ringleader, had used the absence of Francois to pursue his own ambitions. He had become prosperous, married, had a family. Solari and Chaubart had similarly built comfortable lives. They had probably rarely thought about Francois Picaud, assuming he had died in prison or disappeared into obscurity. Francois also learned what had happened to Marguerite, his former fiancée. She had married Loupian. The man who had orchestrated Francois's imprisonment had taken Francois's intended bride. This added another dimension to Francois's rage. Loupian hadn't just destroyed Francois out of jealousy, he had stolen Francois's future wife. The betrayal was complete. But Francois didn't immediately confront his enemies. He understood that rushing to revenge would be satisfying, but ultimately empty. He wanted something more than simple violence. He wanted them to suffer as he had suffered. He wanted to destroy their lives completely, to take from them everything they valued, to make them understand the full weight of what they had done. And he wanted them to know, at the very end, exactly who was destroying them and why. Francois spent years establishing his new identity and insinuating himself into the social circles of his enemies. He presented himself as a wealthy gentleman with business interests, someone worth knowing. He cultivated relationships carefully, never revealing his true identity. He watched his enemies, learning their weaknesses, their fears, their secrets, their vulnerabilities. He was patient, methodical, waiting for exactly the right moments to strike. The first target was Mathieu Loupian, the ringleader. Francois learned that despite his outward prosperity, Loupian had financial vulnerabilities. He had debts, business deals that could go wrong, investments that were risky. Francois began manipulating these vulnerabilities, using his wealth to create financial pressure on Loupian. He bought up Loupian's debts from creditors. He sabotaged business deals. He spread rumors that damaged Loupian's commercial reputation. Slowly, methodically, Francois strangled Loupian financially. Loupian's businesses began failing. His creditors became more aggressive. His comfortable life started crumbling. But Loupian had no idea why this was happening. He thought it was bad luck, market forces, unfortunate circumstances. He never suspected that a man he had betrayed 7 years earlier had returned as a wealthy gentleman specifically to destroy him. As Loupian's financial situation deteriorated, his family life suffered. The stress created conflicts with Marguerite. His children were affected. His social standing declined as word spread of his financial troubles. Francois watched all of this with satisfaction, but he wasn't finished. Financial ruin was just the first phase. Francois then moved to more direct action. He befriended Loupian, presenting himself as a wealthy benefactor who might help Loupian recover from his financial troubles. Loupian, desperate and not recognizing Francois, eagerly accepted this friendship. Francois cultivated a close relationship, gaining Loupian's trust, learning his deepest secrets and vulnerabilities. Then Francois began psychological torture. He would drop hints about the past, mentioned things that only someone who knew about Loupian's betrayal of François Picaud could know. He would reference the accusation of espionage in casual conversation. Watch Loupian's reactions. He created a growing sense of dread in Loupian, a feeling that something from his past was catching up with him, without ever revealing the truth directly. François' revenge against Loupian reached its culmination in a series of calculated actions that destroyed not just Loupian, but his entire family. According to the accounts that inspired Dumas, François kidnapped Loupian's daughter, though historical records differ on exactly what happened. Some versions suggest François arranged for the daughter to disappear, possibly murdering her or selling her into prostitution. Other versions suggest he simply made Loupian believe his daughter was dead or dishonored. Whatever the exact details, François' goal was to inflict on Loupian the same sense of loss and helplessness that François had experienced. François wanted Loupian to feel what it was like to have everything taken away, to be powerless to stop it, to watch his world collapse. And François wanted Loupian to know, finally, who was responsible. When the moment was right, François revealed himself to Loupian. He explained who he really was. François Picaud, the man Loupian had falsely accused of espionage 7 years earlier. He detailed everything he had done to destroy Loupian's life. He explained that every misfortune, every financial disaster, every loss had been orchestrated by François as revenge for the betrayal. Loupian's reaction, according to accounts, was complete psychological breakdown. He had spent years watching his life crumble without understanding why, and now he learned that it had all been deliberate, that a man he thought was dead or forgotten had returned specifically to destroy him. The revelation was devastating. Loupian went to the authorities, but what could he tell them? That a man he had falsely accused years ago was now getting revenge? He was facing his own past crimes. But François wasn't finished with the other conspirators. Solari and Chaubart were next. François applied similar methods to each, using his wealth and connections to destroy their businesses, their reputations, their families. He was relentless and patient, willing to spend years on each target to ensure their destruction was complete. With Solari, François allegedly focused on destroying his business relationships and social standing. Solari was a merchant who depended on credit and reputation. François systematically destroyed both, spreading damaging information, manipulating business deals, ensuring that Solari's ventures failed. Solari, like Loupian before him, watched his comfortable life disintegrate without understanding why. When Solari was ruined financially and socially, François revealed himself. He explained who he was and why Solari's life had been destroyed. The psychological impact was crushing. Solari had probably rarely thought about François Picaud in the intervening years, had probably convinced himself that the false accusation had been justified or forgotten. Now he learned that his victim had returned and had spent years methodically destroying everything Solari valued. Chaubart, the third conspirator, faced similar treatment. François used different tactics suited to Chaubart's specific vulnerabilities, but the pattern was the same: systematic destruction of everything Chaubart valued, followed by the revelation of who was responsible and why. François wanted each of his betrayers to experience the full weight of his revenge, to understand completely what they had done and what price they were paying for it. By the early 1820s, François Picaud had achieved his revenge. All three of the men who had betrayed him had been destroyed, financially ruined, socially disgraced, psychologically broken. But revenge came at a cost to François as well. François had spent over a decade of his life focused entirely on revenge. The years in prison had been stolen from him, but the years he spent orchestrating revenge, he gave away willingly. He had no family, no close relationships, no life beyond his mission to destroy his enemies. The priest's education and the recovered fortune had given him the tools for revenge, but they hadn't given him back the life he had lost. Moreover, François' actions, while understandable as revenge for a terrible injustice, involved criminal activity. He had manipulated people, destroyed livelihoods, possibly kidnapped or murdered. He had become, in pursuing his revenge, a criminal himself. The justice he sought was not legal justice, but personal vengeance, and the methods he used made him guilty of crimes potentially worse than the false accusation that had started everything. The historical record becomes unclear at this point. What exactly happened to François Picaud after he completed his revenge? Some accounts suggest he was eventually arrested and tried for his crimes. Other accounts suggest he lived out his life in comfortable obscurity, his fortune allowing him to avoid legal consequences. Still other versions claim he died shortly after revealing his identity to his final victim, as if the completion of his revenge left him with no reason to continue living. What we know for certain is that François Picaud's story reached the ears of Alexandre Dumas, one of the most popular novelists of 19th century France. Dumas was always looking for dramatic stories to adapt into novels, and the story of François Picaud was perfect. Wrongful imprisonment, transformation, elaborate revenge. But Dumas understood that the story needed to be adapted for a popular audience. In 1844, Alexandre Dumas published The Count of Monte Cristo, a massive novel that would become one of the most popular adventure stories ever written. The novel was inspired by François Picaud's story, but transformed in significant ways. Dumas took the basic framework of Picaud's life: wrongful imprisonment, hidden treasure, transformation, elaborate revenge, and turned it into something more palatable for a general audience. In Dumas' version, Edmond Dantes is a young sailor about to become captain of his ship and marry his beloved Mercedes. He is falsely accused of being a Bonapartist conspirator and imprisoned in the Château d'If. In prison, he befriends Abbé Faria, who educates him and tells him about the treasure of Monte Cristo. After 14 years, Dantes escapes, recovers the treasure, and transforms himself into the wealthy and mysterious Count of Monte Cristo. The Count then systematically destroys the three men who betrayed him: Fernand Mondego, Danglars, and Villefort. But Dumas made crucial changes to François Picaud's story. First, Dumas' revenge is ultimately more merciful. The Count doesn't murder his enemies' children. He saves them. He doesn't completely destroy Mercedes. He provides for her. And crucially, Dumas adds a redemption arc where the Count realizes that revenge has cost him his humanity and chooses to show mercy. Dumas also made the treasure more romantic. Instead of vague historical references to a priest's hidden wealth, the treasure becomes the legendary fortune of Monte Cristo, buried on an island enormous in scope. The Count becomes an almost supernatural figure, impossibly wealthy, appearing in multiple disguises, orchestrating elaborate schemes across Europe. These changes made the story more commercially successful, but also more morally palatable. François Picaud's actual revenge was dark, obsessive, and possibly involved harming innocent people. Dumas' Count of Monte Cristo maintains enough darkness to be thrilling, but includes enough redemption to be uplifting. The novel says, in essence, that revenge is understandable but ultimately destructive, and that mercy is the higher path. The novel was immediately successful and has never gone out of print. It has been adapted into plays, films, television shows, and countless other versions. The Count of Monte Cristo became one of the archetypal revenge stories in Western literature. Millions of people know the story of Edmond Dantes and the Count of Monte Cristo. Very few know about François Picaud. So who was the real Count of Monte Cristo? François Picaud was a shoemaker who was wrongly imprisoned for 7 years due to his friend's jealousy. He emerged from prison educated, wealthy, and obsessed with revenge. He spent over a decade systematically destroying the lives of the men who had betrayed him. Whether this makes him a hero or a villain depends on your perspective on justice, revenge, and the appropriate response to grave injustice. From one perspective, François was completely justified. He was innocent. His accusers knew he was innocent. They destroyed his life deliberately out of petty jealousy. He lost 7 years in a brutal prison, lost his fiancée, lost his livelihood, lost his reputation, all because of a lie. When the legal system failed him, when there was no institutional justice available, he created his own justice. His revenge was proportionate to the harm done to him. From another perspective, Francois became a monster. Yes, he was wronged terribly, but his response was to spend over a decade dedicated entirely to destroying other people's lives. He didn't just punish the guilty, he harmed their families, their children, people who had nothing to do with the original betrayal. He became consumed by revenge to the point where it destroyed his own life as thoroughly as his enemies had destroyed it. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes. François Picaud was a man who suffered a terrible injustice and responded in the only way he felt he could. He lacked faith that the legal system would give him justice, and given that the legal system had imprisoned him falsely in the first place, this lack of faith was understandable. But his revenge, while satisfying on a primal level, didn't restore what he had lost. It didn't give him back his 7 years. It didn't return Marguerite to him. It didn't undo the damage. The story of François Picaud raises uncomfortable questions about justice and revenge. If the legal system fails you, if you are the victim of a terrible injustice and have no institutional recourse, what are you morally permitted to do? Is revenge ever justified? Is there a statute of limitations on seeking revenge? Does the passage of time diminish the validity of your grievance? These are questions without easy answers. What's clear is that François Picaud's story resonated deeply enough to inspire one of literature's greatest novels. The reason The Count of Monte Cristo remains so popular nearly 180 years after publication is that it speaks to something fundamental in human nature: the desire to see wrongs righted, to see the innocent vindicated and the guilty punished. We want to believe that justice, even if delayed, will eventually prevail. But Dumas' novel offers something that François Picaud's real story didn't: redemption. The Count of Monte Cristo ultimately chooses mercy over complete revenge. He realizes that vengeance is consuming him and that there are things more important than destroying his enemies. The novel ends with the Count finding a new life and new purpose. We don't know if François Picaud ever found redemption or peace. Today, you can visit the fortress of Fenestrelle where François was imprisoned. The massive military complex is being restored as a historical site. You can walk the tunnels and see the cells where prisoners like François spent years of their lives. You can stand where François Picaud stood and imagine what it must have been like. The cold, the isolation, the slow realization that you've been betrayed, and the gradual formation of a plan for revenge. The story of François Picaud is ultimately a tragedy. He was a victim who became a perpetrator, a wronged man who became a destroyer, someone who achieved perfect revenge but lost himself in the process. His story inspired great literature, but his own life became consumed by the very injustice he was avenging. The real Count of Monte Cristo wasn't a nobleman. He was a shoemaker. He didn't escape from an island fortress. He was released when the regime that imprisoned him fell. He didn't have a cave full of treasure. He had information from a dying priest. But he did get his revenge perfectly and completely. And whether that revenge brought him peace or simply consumed what remained of his life, we'll never know. What we do know is that 3 men who falsely accused an innocent person paid for their crime, not through legal justice, but through the patient, methodical revenge of the man they had wronged. François Picaud transformed himself from a victim into an avenger, and he proved that with enough patience, enough planning, and enough resources, even the most powerless person can destroy their enemies. The Count of Monte Cristo is fiction, but François Picaud was real, and his revenge was darker than any novel.